Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 123 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, I visit with Jim Moore, the Executive Vice President at the Merrill Corporation, and we visit about the use of translations in your best practices compliance program and how to move from a detect to a prevent to an even a prescriptive mode through the effective use of translations in your compliance program. The episode comes in at just over 25 minutes, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, I'm really excited and thrilled to have my friend Jim Moore with me. Jim is the Executive Vice President of Merrill Brink International. Merrill Brink and I have jointly released a white paper, and Jim is going to help talk us through some of the concepts we're trying to get across in this white paper. So, Jim, welcome, and I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with myself and my audience today.
Thank you, Tom, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you.
Jim, if I could, the theme I would like to have on the podcast is the use of language to help corporations think globally. And perhaps you could help us understand how Merrill Brink International can help companies and corporations located in the United States to really think globally using the tool of language.
Well, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. We are in a global economy, in a global world today, and these connections around the world really require that communications be done as effectively as possible. And too often, when you're trying to talk to typically your employees or your partners in another market, in another language, if you do it just as almost a literal translation of the way you talk to people in your own company, in your own market, in your own language, that can oftentimes be misinterpreted or lead to misunderstandings. So really our approach, our recommendations is that you approach this from a point of view of thinking, creating your content with the end in mind, thinking carefully about who your target audience is, taking into account cultural differences, taking into account vernacular that may be common in one market but not in another, and then making sure that when you draft, and typically what we see is you draft in English, that when you draft your document, the source language that you're creating is written in a way that is going to lend itself to a meaningful and accurate translation.
Jim, as you know, I practice in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act space, and I came to know Merrill through its work in translations, primarily in when investigations would be beginning or ongoing. But one of the things that's really intrigued me about you and your team is you have really led the charge of use of language as part of the solution for an overall FCPA compliance program, moving from simply detection to prevention and perhaps even prescription of something before it becomes a violation. Can you explain to us how a company may be able to think through using language as a preventative tool rather than simply a detection tool?
Absolutely. When we go to a lot of the industry conferences, we're really surprised at the lack of discussion around language as an effective part of your compliance program. I think the focus is on, having things done properly in English, dotting your T's and crossing your I's. And I think for many people, they feel that as long as they do that, they have laid the basis for an effective preventative program. And again, going back to my earlier comment about globalization, failure to communicate effectively in local languages and to really think of yourself as a global company and not, in this case, let's say a U.S. company that happens to have global offices. And I think the difference there is more than just semantics. It's a mindset that you bring to how you manage your compliance program. So if you think of yourself truly as a global company and your other markets are on an equal footing in terms of the importance of communication, then what happens is you bake into your whole compliance program the importance and the need for translating and localizing your materials. So what happens then is you have a program that treats all of the different languages and all the different markets equally. And as a result of that, you have a more informed and educated workforce or third-party partners who, if they read the materials that you produce, will be more informed and better positioned to avoid the types of traps that we see too often today and that are on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and other newspapers regularly.
Jim, one of the things that the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission communicated to us in the 2012 FCPA guidance was this need to communicate to companies to communicate to their employees and third-party providers in a local language. Is that something you've seen resonate with your clients and others you've met with as you've discussed these issues?
Absolutely. Getting back to the companies that we see at some of the trade conferences, I really feel like they fall into two categories. There are those who really embrace this, and they tend to be, I think, companies that are generally more progressive in terms of how they're building their business. They're truly companies that look at themselves as global, and it emanates with the people that the compliance officers that you meet at the conferences. They are truly invested in making their compliance program a global one. And I think generally when you see the companies that are getting into trouble, they are ones who have to admit oftentimes that they were perhaps not as vigilant in trying to localize materials, and as a result they were too overly reliant on either their global workforce relying on English, well-written, perhaps English compliance policies and procedures, or B, a more informal attempt to translate those materials, such as having local employees in different countries take the English document and do some type of translation, perhaps editing it in the process, and producing something that perhaps in their mind passes muster, but oftentimes is missing critical parts of the message that's emanating in the source documents.
Jim, one of the other key concepts I've heard you and your team talk about is a language service provider as really a key partner of a company's compliance function and indeed its overall compliance program. How does a company like Merrill really work as a partner with a compliance function or a company to move from simply a detect to a preventative mode?
That's a very good question, Tom, and it really starts with, I think, this concept of a partnership. And what I mean by that is when we talk to a company about their compliance program, we don't just say to them, tell us what languages you need to have it translated in, and we'll tell you how long it's going to take and how much it will cost. Rather, what we try to do is really talk to that person about what it is they're trying to achieve through this. Why are they making the investment? Let's face it, it's not inexpensive to translate materials. So why are they making this investment, and what are some of the things they're trying to accomplish? And, what we'll do with them is we will talk to them about language tools that they can use, such as translation memories and glossaries. And these tools will allow them to translate and build up a memory so that when they update these materials, or if they create new materials that are drawn from previously existing ones, they will not have to reinvent the wheel every time they do so. The glossaries also ensure that key terminology is translated consistently every time, and the translators know what words to use to ensure that the message is consistent. This is a much different approach than, again, if I go back to my point earlier about a company trying to do it in-house, where every country is more or less on their own to try to translate something into their particular language. That's a much more decentralized solution. You could end up very easily having a message in Brazil in Portuguese be much different in meaning than the one that is in French in Europe. So what we try to do with these companies is say, again, tell us what it is you're trying to achieve. What are the things that are really important to you within the context of your compliance and ethics program? We will then work with them to both develop, like I said, a glossary of terms We'll establish a translation memory, and then we will add typically a third step, which we call in-country review. And we'll build this into the whole production cycle so that, as I often tell people, get us in touch with the people who you think are going to be most vocal about the quality of the translation for their market, and let's get them into the process so that they have an opportunity to review, especially early in the days of a partnership, so that they have an opportunity to review what we translate, make what often are stylistic changes, and that's fine, and we respect that, and make sure that it reads in a way that they feel is going to be most effective for their local market. So those are some of the difference rather than just doing a literal translation.
Jim, you said something in there that really resonated with me, which is along the lines of consistency. Consistency across a variety of languages, consistency across a variety of geographic areas, but a consistent message that a company would communicate to its employees or to its third parties. How can a company like Merrill really help bring specifically that consistency from a Portuguese to a French to a Chinese to an across the globe business enterprise?
Well, again, I think it starts with the source document. You write originally with the ends in mind. So you say to yourself, and we'll work with a company around this, there's an element of language consulting that goes on here. So we say, let's look at the English language draft. Again, that's mostly what we see is the source document being in English. And let's review the concepts and the terms that you are choosing, the style that you're adopting. And again, let's make sure that we don't see in there certain aspects of the English text that we know from our own experience is not going to resonate or translate easily into all or certain languages. And so what we'll try to do there is we'll try to come up with an English source document that truly renders itself to being globalized for all the other markets they're going into, and that you're not going to have a problem of certain English text not translating efficiently. I'll give you a quick example, and it's a bit of a humorous one. You might say, this is more of a marketing example, but you might say, Big Apple goes bananas. Now, you and I know, I think, what I'm talking about there, but you can imagine if you try to translate that, first of all, you'd never translate it literally. It wouldn't make sense in any language outside of English. It may not make sense outside of New York. But we would say we don't think the use of those terms, that term, is a good way to describe the activity going on in the New York market right now. It's not going to translate well. So let's think about how we can convey that same message without using those terms. So When you come back to a compliance and ethics document, it's taking the extreme example I just shared and really looking at it in a more measured way for the policies and procedures that are being drafted.
Jim, if I could turn to what a company might need if they find themselves on the front page of the Wall Street Journal with a letter from the Department of Justice or Securities and Exchange Commission, basically when it all hits the fan. How can language be a part of your investigative function and your investigative solution when you have to move in that direction?
That's another great question because, obviously when something like this happens, it's all hands on deck. It's typically an immediate call to the forensic accountants. It's a call to outside counsel. It's a call to, in-house folks. And everyone is coming at this from oftentimes, again, we're talking mainly about U.S. companies from an English language perspective. And they're looking at what the exposure is, what are the consequences, how are they going to build the investigation. And oftentimes language, when it's a part of an investigation like this, and it often is if we're talking about FCPA, then the language becomes an obstacle that has to be overcome. And oftentimes the people that are working on this are not necessarily familiar with this because for them it may be the first time they're doing an investigation, or perhaps it's the first time they're doing an investigation in a certain language. And so what we advise in a case like that is right from the beginning to include the the subject of how are we going to manage the collection of foreign language documents, how are we going to work the presence of those documents into our entire investigation, and how are we going to schedule the investigation so that we make sure that we have enough time to do the translations that are going to be necessary. Now, one other comment here is that in some investigations obviously are larger than others. So if it's a relatively small amount of foreign language data that you are collecting, then oftentimes you can just go ahead and translate that, and it can be done fairly quickly, and there's no big delay in your own investigation. But on the other hand, if you have witness statements that are extensive, or if you're collecting, gigabytes of foreign language email, and you're looking at thousands of documents rather than a couple, then you've got to adopt a strategy that allows you to efficiently sort through those emails, find smoking gun documents, and hopefully avoid the very expensive and time-consuming task of literally translating all of that.
So the key thing, or actually you said several key things in there, but how does a company find a qualified language service provider?
Well, that's another good question. Too often I think there's an informal process. Well, first of all, some companies have already gone through a procurement vetting process, and they may have a translation company on the books. Now, if they do have to ask themselves, is this a translation company that was selected because they translate our website, our marketing materials, or perhaps our product manuals, and that's where their knowledge and expertise is. But they also had experience doing translations relative to an investigation. They understand what the stakes are in a FCPA investigation. They understand the urgency for getting things done very quickly. Are they available on a 24/7 basis? If the investigation is going to be in jurisdictions around the world, are they going to be able to support the time zone considerations that are going to arise when you send people to China or Russia or Brazil, for example, to do the investigation, to do the witness statements, et cetera? Are they familiar with what's required for submission to the DOJ or the SEC in order to effectively give them the documents that they need? These are questions that I think have to be asked, because every translation company is not equal when it comes to being able to respond to these particular types of investigations. Again, a translation company A might be very good at doing the website and the marketing materials, but they may be much less suitable for doing an investigation. And so you have to, I think, you have to look at what you have already. You have to talk to outside counsel and the forensic group that you've hired, perhaps, to find out what experience they have, and oftentimes they can recommend a partner to work with and for whom it has worked well. That's typically, what we see. And when we get engaged in projects, sometimes it's the company choosing us. Many times it's outside counsel, or it could be one of the forensic accounting firms that are involved.
So the really, I guess what I heard you say was that there's several different levels of service providers, and that companies, when it really does hit the fan and they do need to bring in an expert, they really need to think through and vet who they're going to use, because there's different levels of sophistication, both in terms of service providers, but also in terms of what the companies are going to need.
Absolutely. And while everyone is concerned about the price as well, it's not just a matter of, translations are typically charged on a per word basis. But it's not just a matter of how much is company A charging per word versus company B charging per word. It's also what experience does that company have in dealing with these matters, as I mentioned earlier, and what type of solutions do they offer that are going to make a material difference in saving time and cost. For example, going back to that 1,000 documents, It's not just a question of, we believe we're going to have to translate all of these documents because we don't know what they say. And so we're going to look for somebody that's going to give us the best price per word to translate all these documents, and the one who says they can do it the quickest. That's a fairly short-sighted approach. What we would recommend in a case like that would be, first of all, do you have the ability to do keyword searching, in which case perhaps you should be translating key terms to search, and not just one word-for-word translation, but oftentimes multiple iterations of those keywords so that you can make sure you cast a wide net and you're able to identify all of the documents that have potential hits for what it is you're looking for. That oftentimes can reduce a very large document collection to a much more manageable one.
Jim, that sounds almost like a topic for a completely separate podcast, just thinking through that itself. So maybe I ought to save that for another podcast. We're nearing the end of our time, and I wanted to end with one of the things you touched on really throughout this, and that's something called translation memory. And that, as I understand it, and the way you guys have explained that to me, it can be a huge cost saving to companies if they partner with a translation language service provider, I should say. Could you explain translation memory and how that works really in both the preventative and the detective mode?
Yes, translation memory is essentially software that exists when you translate initially a document in English, let's say, to French. You now have two versions of that document. And if you set it up originally in a translation memory software, then the next time that you have an English document that you need to translate to French, instead of just translating it from scratch, what you do is you take English document number 2, you essentially do a comparison. The software does a comparison between the two versions, and it produces right on the screen a highlighted display that shows you all of the language that is a 100% match of that which has been previously translated, or a close match of that which has been previously translated. Now the translator who's working on this particular document is able to look at that, and they know not to translate the things that match and to only translate on those other ones the words that are not matching. And then, of course, typically you'll have a new text, new content that has to be translated entirely. And as you can imagine, as you go on to Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5 of English documents being submitted against this database of translated French content, the result is an increasingly higher percentage of content that does not need to be translated again. And this results in significant savings for the consumer of the translation services. And it also helps to, as I said earlier, maintain standards, because once you've agreed on the language, then the translation memory will make sure that you're using previously translated text instead of reinventing it with each iteration of a translation.
Jim, we're unfortunately at the end of our time. This has been a really great podcast, a lot of excellent information. I hope my listeners will really begin to embrace, if not understand, the concept of moving from detect to prevent through Translation Solutions as a preventative tool. There's a lot more information about what Jim has talked about in the white paper jointly released by Merrill and myself called From Detect to Prevent Translation Solutions as a Preventative Tool in Anti-Corruption Compliance Programs. Jim, is this where would listeners go to find this on the Merrill website if they wanted to download a copy of it?
Our website is merrillbrink.com, merrillbrink.com. If you go to that website and you look at our front page, you will find a description and links to this white paper.
And Jim, if anyone wanted to have had some specific questions or wanted to get in touch with you, is there a way they could email you or some other way to get in touch with you?
Absolutely. I think email would be the best way, and my email address is jim.moore, M-O-O-R-E, at Merrill Corp, MERRILLCORP, corp.com.
Well, Jim, I'd like to thank you for coming on the podcast. I'd also like to thank you for really help lead the way in people teaching and communicating to people like me the way to use language in different aspects of your compliance program. It's not simply for investigations. It's really a part of your complete compliance regime and solution going forward. And I look forward to further conversations along these lines.
Thank you very much, Tom. I've enjoyed it myself.
All right.
Bye now.